So Porsche has a long history of turning up to racing series, raising hell, and then leaving. They're basically racing's answer to Stone Cold Steve Austin. You turn up, you don't say anything, you give everybody a stunner, drink a few beers, and then exit. And audiences love it. And the most recent example of this was the 919 Le Mans prototype that dominated endurance racing in the French countryside for a few years. It was Porsche's return to top-level endurance racing, and when the 919 arrived at Le Mans, attendances were the highest they'd been in years. And in the process, Porsche would break Audi's stranglehold at Le Mans and the World Endurance Championship and win it in 2015, 16 and 17 before withdrawing. Has to be said though, in all of that, they only scored a 1-2 at Le Mans once in the 4 attempts that they made. But wind the clock back to the early 1970s and you'll see that Porsche has already done this. Well, sort of, because there are a few things on par with the Mazda 787B, Mandela effect and things like that. There's stories on the internet that have either been exaggerated or just fabricated. And that is the time that Roger Penske brought a 917 to Can-Am. The 917/30, which is the exact car we're looking at, had its roots in Europe, specifically the 1969 edition of Le Mans, and the car had a few teething issues. It was a long-tail style Porsche, and they'd found in testing the car was generating lift at high speed, not something you want while heading up the Mulsanne at 200 miles an hour, which at that time had no chicanes. And funnily enough, Ford had encountered similar issues while testing the GT in preparation for their Fuck Ferrari run between 1966 and, 1969 as it so happens. The 917 had been built with low drag in mind. It wasn't as powerful as the Ford, and while at this time Formula 1 and Can-Am were starting to use wings to generate some extra grip in high-speed turns, sports cars weren't quite on that level, and out of the circuits they visited, half of them were low drag. Monza, Spa, Le Mans, Daytona, and the Österreich-Ring. But despite being geared for half of the season, the car would only win in Austria. And Porsche had worked out a way to improve the car for 1970, using a rather nifty method of working out the airflow. And today you'll see Formula 1 cars with that green goo all over them to show the airflow across the car, a variation of it seen in that Top Gear episode with the art exhibition. In 1970, that FlowViz paint or whatever they call it didn't exist, so Porsche looked to a more natural solution. Dead bugs. When the car came back after its test run at what we now know as the Red Bull Ring, they saw that it was covered in dead bugs, and these dead bugs covered the car with the exception of the rear, indicating to the team that the rest of the car was blocking the airflow to the rear wing. So they cobbled together a fix with some aluminium sheeting, and this resulted in the short tail version of the car, the 917K, the K coming from Kurzek, the German for short tail. However, there was some sort of issue. Porsche had agreed with John Wyatt and his team that they'd be the official Porsche entry, but the Porsche family was working with the Martini Porsche team. But instead of fighting, Porsche just gave them both money instead. They then built a long-tail car that was better than the previous year's car that actually handled well on the low-drag circuits. And in the 1970 World Sports Car Championship, Porsche took 100% of the points on offer, thanks to the best results counting system. They won every race, except for Sebring. But in 1971, the World Sports Car Championship was a little more competitive. Porsche won 7 of 10, not 9 of 10. But in 1971, an American called Roger Penske decided that he was going to buy a Porsche and run it, and at the same time he started developing the car for use in the Can-Am series. This 917/20, painted in the famous pink pig livery, was used at the 1971 24 Hours of Le Mans, but it crashed with brake failure. Roger then went back to the drawing board for the 1972 Can-Am season. So then, Can-Am. A series you've probably heard a lot about but don't know a lot about, and that's fine because neither do I. But it was basically a no-holds-barred sports car racing series. Run what you want essentially, and these races took place across the United States and Canada. Hence the name. Can-Am was running wings before Formula 1. There was a type of fan car in use before Gordon Murray had a go with his design concept at Brabham, and the drivers were basically a who's who of racing at that time. And I've put a list of some of them on your screen. Not all of them, some of them. I haven't forgotten anybody. What it was blank check racing. Some of the cars were using things like titanium on them, which was being used on the SR-71 Blackbird and the space stuff and things like that. Engines had no power restrictions, no displacement restrictions, and if you could build an engine that had 9 turbochargers on and produced 9 million horsepower, and provided it didn't blow up after 30 yards, you could run it. These cars were straight line monsters mainly, but they could still get around a racetrack in a similar time to a Formula 1 car. Now, up until this point, Porsche had a 908 Spider in this series, but it was underpowered and often used by some of the lower budget teams. In this series, 350 horsepower was a nothing figure really, and the car was based off the 917K Le Mans car with a heavy as hell flat 12 in the front. That was until Roger Penske turned up in a yellow and blue Sunoco branded car that was, for all intents and purposes, a 917K turned up to 11. Penske had turned up with a car that had a turbocharged 5-litre flat 12 that produced something in the region of 900 horsepower, and given this was the Denny Hulme and Bruce McLaren show up until this point, with drivers alternating their wins of the championship since 1967, it was actually seen as being a good thing. There was now competition. The stranglehold by McLaren had been broken, and while Penske had turned up and made the series a bit more competitive, it had also shown what this series was about. Pushing things beyond what was deemed necessary. But then 1973 happened, which I touched upon in my F1 budgets video I did a couple of weeks ago. In this period, the costs of everything went up. Oil prices doubled, energy prices were up, and inflation was rampant everywhere. And in a series such as Can-Am, where it was blank check racing, if you didn't have someone like a major sports car or motoring manufacturer behind you, then you were in trouble. And even Can-Am knew that it had to do something. But not before Penske turned up to the 1973 series with a revised car and a bigger engine that now chucked out 1,000 horsepower. They had to make the car longer and upgrade everything to make sure it didn't send the driver into the Delta Quadrant with the slightest tap of the throttle. 2022 Formula 1 power in 1973, making it the most powerful sports car ever made, in terms of a racing spec sports car anyway. It won all but 2 races that season, and the performance earned it the nickname the Turbo Panzer. But Porsche and Penske weren't done there. They took the car to Talladega and tried to set a new speed record on a closed circuit. It did an average speed of 221 miles an hour and reached 240 on the straights. One driver who had the honour of giving this car a run at Goodwood asked how much power it had, and the response was a shrug, with the verbal answer being probably 1100. The car would spin both wheels up, changing gear at 150 miles an hour, and it drank so much fuel it was a joke. That same driver asked what it was like to race, and the response to that was, there was never actually any plan to race it. It was designed to qualify first, lead every lap, and win. But no one could compete in 1973, so for 1974 a lot of people decided they weren't going to lob all that money at something just to lose, so a lot of people left the series for Formula 1 and SCCA series. A depleted grid was there in 1974, which Arrow's founder Jackie Oliver won. Porsche didn't turn up, so it was basically just whoever was left, really. Now here's where we get into the no, that's not true, it was all made up, Jonathan Frakes meme bit. The misconceptions surrounding the 917/30 are similar to the ones surrounding the Mazda 787B. With the Mazda, the popular narrative is they banned it because it was too fast and or too loud, but that's not the case. The Mazda was always going to be banned because of the switch to the F1 engine rules that banned rotaries for 1992 whatever happened. With the 917/30 though, the narrative is it was so fast it killed Can-Am through being dominant, with the further part being that Porsche went over to America in 1972 and smashed it immediately. However, Joe Siffert had used a modified 908 in the 1969 Can-Am season and had come a credible 4th in the McLaren Cup that year. But the thing is, the 1973 economic struggle did as much damage to the series as Penske did through having a warp drive in the front. That and the car in 1972 was actually the 917/10, the 10 being how many seconds it would take to reach Jupiter with that engine, I'm assuming. Because of the financial hit that everybody took during 1973, Can-Am tried to reel things in to try and keep the competition going. One of the things they did was impose a 3 mile per gallon limit on fuel consumption, and this was because the oil prices had gone up and therefore petrol prices had gone up because the Middle Eastern nations were putting embargoes on countries that supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War. But because of the costs that still remain, nobody was really there for the 1974 season, and the series in its original form died after that season. The last race of 1974 wasn't even run as interest and participation dwindled. It was, however, revived in 1977 and finished again in 1987, with several names from the world of Formula 1 being on the entry list once again. And obviously, it wouldn't be the last time Roger Penske entered a car with a warp engine fitted. In 1994, he'd use an opening in the rulebook for the Indy 500 to collaborate with Ilmor on building a top-secret skunkworks-style engine. Roger and his unfair advantages keeping racing history books alive since 1966. So then, a look at the powerful, mythical, mental, whatever you want to call it, Porsche 917/30. If you've learned something new here today, then do give the video a like, and if you want to see more stuff like this, get subscribed if you haven't already, and also get the bell on so you never miss out on a future video. Massive thanks as ever to the folk over at Patreon, and if you want to help support this channel at a more personal level, you can join the people on your screen by clicking the link in the description, where there'll also be links to Discord and also to my socials. So until next time, I've been Aidan. Have a great day wherever you live in the world, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. Goodbye.